Thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful crowd. What a beautiful setting. I think speaking for both of us, just delighted to be here with you. I am particularly honored and delighted to be getting to interview Venki Ramakrishnan, someone who I've admired from afar. And now I have the great opportunity to talk to him about his career, about his book. We have about 50 minutes with 10 minutes at the end for questions. Hopefully questions and not speeches that Venki will be happy to answer. Venki, if I may, what a pleasure to get to talk to you. I must say, life is a terminal condition, and it's not something we're very happy about. Do you have news in here that might give us hope for the fact that life is not a terminal condition?
That's been the hope of humanity ever since we were aware of mortality. I like to say that we may be the only species that's aware of our mortality. Animals may know about death, but we know that we have an expiration date. And that somehow influenced human culture for a long time. But in the last 50 years, we've actually made tremendous strides in understanding why we age. And it's aging that effectively, ultimately leads to death. I'm not talking of accidents or disease, but I'm talking of this inevitable death that you have. And there are, because we now are starting to understand how we age at various levels, there is the hope that we might be able to slow down the process, or at the very least, allow us to be healthy in old age. I would say if you ask most aging researchers, they'd be optimistic about keeping us healthier as we age, but only a small sort of fringe group would say we're going to start postponing the inevitable.
So your first book, I would say, for the lay reader was really about the work that got you the Nobel Prize, about the ribosome gene machine. And it's a wonderful sort of description of the race to explain the function of the ribosome, which, you know, Venki can take credit for and was recognized for. And so my question is, after that, why this topic? Was it related to the ribosome? What made you pick the idea of longevity?
People ask me that. There were a couple of reasons. One is, it is related to my work on protein synthesis, because the work on the ribosome is really about how the body makes proteins using encoded genetic information. And it's that orchestra of proteins that we make that's what keeps us alive. And that process declines with age. It's not, it's less well controlled as we age. And that's one of the main causes of aging. So my work is peripherally related to aging, but I don't actually work on aging per se myself. So you can think of me as adjacent to the aging field. But one reason to write it is that the field has exploded, partly because societies are all getting older. And so there's a real incentive on the part of many countries to ensure that their aging populations remain healthy. And so there's a lot of research and money into aging, but at the same time, there's a lot of private money into aging. There are about 700 companies with many tens of billions of dollars at stake in producing what I call longevity treatments. And this has led to a whole spectrum from very mainstream ideas to some somewhat far out and really at one end, really very dubious practices. And so I thought it would be a good idea for someone who is a molecular biologist who's close to the field, but doesn't have any skin in the game. Many other books are written by people who have anti-aging companies, or they're selling you supplements or things like that. And I thought it'd be good for somebody like me to try and take a hard look at what is real, what is possible, and what's just hype.
Thank you. You know, I found the book wonderful to read, because there were so many revelations for me, one of which is that progress in science is never linear. It was always, a few iconoclastic individuals who made some spark of discovery and moved the field a little further. And I think your book really catered to someone like me who loves story, who loves the idea of stories behind all these different advances. And so I suppose I want to ask you, did you know all this stuff ahead of time, or did you actually stumble onto these stories as you're researching the book?
Some of it I knew, but a lot of it I simply discovered in the course of writing the book and just reading a lot and reading about the field. I also learned a lot by talking to leading longevity researchers. And in particular, I should acknowledge Linda Partridge, who was a fellow officer of mine at the Royal Society. And she really helped me, because there are 300,000 papers on aging published in the last 10 years alone. So for somebody who's not in the field to be able to navigate that and figure out what's really important and what isn't, wouldn't have been easy without talking to people.
One of the ideas that you state early in the book, which I really found astonishing, and yet something I suppose I should have known as a physician, but I didn't, which is that our biology is only geared towards reproducing ourselves. It really doesn't care about our desire to have a meaningful life or to live a long time. It just wants us to reproduce ourselves.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Did you know that? Did you stumble at it?
So this is something I didn't actually, I had a misconception. I thought that maybe death evolved for the good of the species, because if you didn't have death, you wouldn't get regeneration and new combinations of genes and so on. But it turns out that's an erroneous idea. It turns out evolution doesn't really care at all whether you die or whether you live a long time. All that evolution selects for is something called fitness, because after all, what is evolution? Evolution is simply selecting the survival of genes. It's whatever genes survive will go on and be selected for. If they don't survive, they'll die out. And so there is always this problem in biology of choosing between living a very long time, which requires resources. You have to then maintain and repair the body constantly. That takes resources. Versus maturing very quickly and reproducing very quickly. Now, why would you do one or the other? Well, imagine you're a mouse. A mouse, there wouldn't be any benefit in having a mouse live for 40 or 50 years, because long before that, it would be eaten by a predator, or it would die of starvation or some external cause. And so in the case of a mouse, it makes more sense for the mouse to grow very rapidly and reproduce very fast, so that it passes on its genes before it's met an untimely or a timely end. In the case of larger animals, like whales or certain sharks, it does pay for them to live a much longer time, because they can then reproduce over a longer time. They have a longer time for gestation. And also larger animals typically have slower metabolism than smaller animals. And so you see this variation in lifespan across species, from insects which only live a day or a few days, all the way to animals that live several hundred years, even though they're all made of the same material, DNA and protein and RNA and lipid and so on. And so it's this balance that has been selected for evolutionarily for each species that really determines the lifespan. And there's a side effect to that, and that is evolution will often select for traits that benefit you when you're young, when you're growing and maturing, even if those same properties that are selected for are actually harmful in old age. They cause you to age and cause you problems in old age. And there are many examples of that. Some of them are ones which affect growth pathways, but there are others that affect cancer. So things that prevent cancer early in life are often the cause of aging later in life.
And I think you mentioned as an example, which I found astonishing, that menopause probably has a function to allow the woman to not be reproducing at a time when she could be helping be a grandmother. Is that speculation, or is
I'm
that
not sure. I'm not sure. I describe the various theories of menopause. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. That's a very popular theory, which is that it's more advantageous. Well, first there was the mother hypothesis, which is it's more advantageous for a woman to look after her children. And remember, a child has to reach maturity, adulthood, before they're truly independent. So you should be able to continue to invest in your child until they're grown up, rather than continue to have your own child. So you need to have a certain amount of years after your last child was born to see them through maturity. And of course, the risk of childbirth increases with age. So that's another reason. So that's one theory. Another theory, which goes one generation further, was proposed by an anthropologist at the University of Utah, which is that the reason for menopause is it's better to look after your grandchildren and invest in that generation than have more of your own kids. Now, the problem is these are what are called adaptive theories, and many evolutionary biologists aren't quite happy about them. There's, the one thing they would ask is, why would you want to raise someone with only a quarter of your genes when you could be having more children with half your genes? So from a genetic propagation point of view, it doesn't actually make sense. So another idea of menopause is that about 40,000 years ago, our lifespan changed quite a lot. That is our natural lifespan. I'm not talking of the recent doubling of lifespan in the last 150 years, but I'm talking about 40,000 years ago. And so it could be that the number of eggs in a human female have simply evolved for that kind of lifespan, and there hasn't been enough time to catch up, for the physiology to change to catch up with that. So I think that's probably the one as a sort of biologist I would favor. But I have to say it's an open question. And it's a hotly debated question, and it's somewhat politicized and ideological.
And these things are extraordinarily hard to prove compared to the kind of basic lab work that you do.
That's right. They can't do the experiment very easily. That's true.
The one thing I really appreciated reading the book was how much delight it seemed to me you took in the characters responsible for this advance and that advance. You like the best of nonfiction, you describe them, you describe their mannerism. I'm talking about the pioneering individuals who, move the bar in this direction, that direction. And I found that the real charm of the book is that we could relate to the stories. And I wondered if you would share with us one of the more compelling individuals, as well as the science that you associated with that person.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the big drugs that's touted as having potential for anti-aging is called rapamycin. Now, the way rapamycin was discovered was by a tortuous path. The first step was that a bunch of Canadian scientists decided to go to Easter Island and take soil samples because they were looking for bacteria that were producing new types of antibiotics. And from one of those soil samples, they found one bacterium produced a compound which they named rapamycin, because Rapa Nui is the name for Easter Island given by the natives. And they said, let's call this rapamycin. And it turned out to be a fungicide, which means it could kill yeast and other fungi. And that was interesting. But then the guy who started looking at it, a fellow named Sagal, who was of Indian origin, but in Canada, he decided to see if there were other things that rapamycin did. And in collaboration with some people at NIH, he found that it was an anti-tumor agent. And so this led him to be interested in it. But then his company, his pharmaceutical company in Canada, got bought by Wyeth, which was in New Jersey. And nobody seemed to be interested in rapamycin. But he had a hunch that it was going to be important. So he grew up a huge amount of the bacteria and collected it in a paste and put it all in an ice cream carton and stored it in his home freezer, marked "Don't eat," presumably so his kids wouldn't think it was ice cream. And then when they moved, and this is obviously before 9/11, when customs between Canada and the US were more lax, he just took it with him to New Jersey, and he convinced his bosses there that they should continue investigating rapamycin. And from that, it turned out that rapamycin is an immunosuppressive drug, and it's given, for example, to people who've had organ transplants to prevent rejection of the organ. And then for a while, nobody understood how rapamycin worked. And then 2 Americans and an Indian working in Basel, Switzerland, figured out that rapamycin actually bound to a receptor on the in yeast. They were working with yeast, but we all have these receptors called TOR. And this receptor is really the trigger for a major metabolic pathway that also affects aging. So here you go all the way from some fishing expedition for soil samples through an antifungal, an immunosuppressive drug, to an anti-aging drug. So rapamycin has had, you could say, many reincarnations. There's one other weird thing, and that is, we all worry about Alzheimer's as we get older because it is one of those diseases that's very hard to treat. And one of the ideas of this disease is it's due to proteins misbehaving and forming aggregates. Well, one of the first examples of something that was not viral or bacterial, but that could be transmitted, was the disease called Kuru, which was a disease that tribes in New Guinea called the Foray tribes had. And a guy named Carlton Gajdusek, an American, who went to Australia and then to New Guinea, figured out that it was done because it was transmitted because these tribal people were eating the brains of their deceased ancestors. It was a way of absorbing the spirit of their ancestors. And so from that, he figured out this non-viral, non-bacterial transmission of a disease. And since it was a completely unexpected mode of transmission, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. A few years later, a couple of decades later, he was also arrested and convicted for being a child molester, because when he went back to Washington, to the National Cancer Institute, he brought along a number of young boys from the Foray tribe in order to educate them, but he also had various other relations with them. And so here you have another complicated story, which is going from some disease prevalent in a tribe in New Guinea all the way to something that's informing our understanding of Alzheimer's, again, with a somewhat weird and certainly a non-standard character.
I want to come back to rapamycin, which where I live in the Bay Area, everybody seems to be consuming, whether there's data or not.
People are taking rapamycin sort of off prescription.
I know. It made me reassured to read your book to realize that I don't think they're well founded in that premise, but we'll come back to that. I think what struck me was, in parallel with the kind of genius and iconoclastic, groundbreaking way of thinking that an individual scientist had that charted a new path, also seemed to come a quirky personality trait. Sometimes it was just that, it was eccentricity. Sometimes, as you cited, it was bordering on the criminal. And I guess this is a question not based on any personal observation. I've had the most delightful time spending some time with Venki at the last two book festivals we attended together in India in the last few days. Unfortunately, Indigo lost his luggage, so if you have any pull with Indigo, please tell them it's shameful to lose the luggage of a Nobel Prize winner. It just shouldn't be happening. But so I wanted to ask you, and this is not based on any observation, do you think that your colleagues and friends see you as having an eccentric streak to go with your genius?
Sorry, a what sort of streak?
An eccentric streak. Given the premise that most of these...
Well, I like to think of myself as normal, but when I tell that to my family, they laugh at me. So, so I must be slightly weird or eccentric. But I think genius is a much bandied about term. I think there are very few real geniuses. I may have met one or two in my life. I think most people have some combination of tenacity, ambition, good luck, and the luck part is very important as well. I would say one thing, the aging community seems to attract more than a share of really egotistic people. And I wonder if that's partly because, you know, you have to be somehow think that you're playing God if you want to extend life beyond its normal lifespan. But people say the same thing about surgeons, so, you know.
So I want to come to, you know, the fact that there are so many aging books out there, as you pointed out, but almost all of them, without exception, have some sort of vested interest or undeclared, you know, product that's being sold or a thesis that's being advanced. And I think I really appreciated that you were trying to give us the facts and you didn't seem to have any particular need to declare any interest that would be
I'm not, I wouldn't say that I'm poo-pooing it all. I'm just trying to be sort of even-handed and trying to say what areas might be promising.
Which I really appreciated. And what I wanted to ask you is, even though you've done that, you've been very clear-sighted about these advances, the fact remains people are taking an awful lot of things. And so if we could just run through a quick list and have you comment on, say, metformin, rapamycin, antioxidants, you know, countermeasures such as vitamin C, vitamin D, and I'm sure I'm missing a few, but most of them are based on a good premise, but the proof isn't there. Perhaps you could run us through the top three, perhaps.
So I will tell you about rapamycin. Let's go through that list. So rapamycin is this anti-immune drug. It's an immunosuppressive drug. And it's prescribed for people who have organ transplants, for example. Now, the problem with giving it to... Now, if you're an organ transplant recipient, of course you should take rapamycin or some immunosuppressor, or you'll reject your graft. But if you're a healthy individual, the equation's very different. Why would you take something that's an immunosuppressant and makes you more prone to infections and also lots of other side effects? Why would you take that over a prolonged period? That's not clear to me. And the safety trials have not actually been done. And what the rapamycin advocates say is, well, we won't give it at very high doses where it'll be immunosuppressive. We'll try and modulate the dose so we get the benefits without the side effects. But nobody's actually done a dose response curve. And that's all happening. But in the meantime, people are jumping the gun and they're all quietly taking rapamycin. And part of it is everybody feels they're getting old and they don't want to wait 20 years for the trials to be definitive. They say, well, why should I age then? You know, I'm pretty sure it's going to work. So it shows you scientists are no more objective or rational about themselves than anybody else. The other is that you mentioned metformin. Now, metformin is a widely used anti-diabetic drug. It's in fact a leading drug for type 2 diabetes. And we don't have a really definitive idea of how metformin works, but there are some indications of how it might work. Now, the question is whether it has any effect on aging. And there were some early papers which suggested that diabetics on metformin lived longer even than non-diabetics, which was quite a surprising finding. But it turns out that isn't really true. Let's put it this way. It turns out there were contradictory papers after that. So the field is a little uncertain, and what it requires is a systematic study on healthy people, preferably a randomized trial on healthy people taking metformin, and seeing if it's slowing down their aging and if they're healthier. And there are trials like that that have essentially begun, but nobody knows yet what the answer is. But it again hasn't stopped people, healthy people, from taking metformin. You mentioned antioxidants. Well, antioxidants have a very good basis because one of the causes of chemical damage in our cells are what are these so-called reactive oxygen species. These are partial products of oxidation of sugar in our cells. And if you use antioxidants, the idea is that while you'll scavenge away these nasty chemicals and you'll protect yourself, it's all good in theory, and it has occasionally shown to work in animals, but you also have the opposite being true in animals. And moreover, taking antioxidants in humans or in mice, given antioxidants, has shown no effect on their longevity. And this doesn't mean that the idea is wrong. It means that taking oxidants in your diet, antioxidants in your diet, is not the same as providing them at the site where they're needed. In a form, so they're not metabolized and presented to the site as needed. So as with all of these things, there's some scientific basis, and then people are jumping the gun because they're impatient. They don't want to age. That's a human desire.
Before we leave that, I can't resist but ask you about forms of intermittent fasting, not so much for aging, but in terms of their benefit, because you really go into it in a wonderful, understandable way. What about intermittent fasting and fasting as a mechanism for the organism against inflammation, cancer, and thereby perhaps longevity?
Yeah, so in all species, when people do caloric restriction studies, the animals are healthier. They resemble younger animals, and often their lifespan is increased by some amount. I believe it's around 30%. Now, of course, there's a caveat to this, and that is that they're always comparing animals with just enough calories to live, to be sustainable, not starving, but actually sustainable. They're comparing those animals with animals who have an all-you-can-eat diet. So some people have argued that all it says is that an all-you-can-eat diet is bad for you. And there's no question that that's true. But nevertheless, it suggests that if you lower your caloric intake, then it does have a number of benefits. And one of the pathways that rapamycin acts on is actually also one of the pathways that is turned on by caloric restriction. So rapamycin acts on something called the TOR pathway, which is one of the pathways affected by reducing your caloric intake. Now, the question of intermittent fasting is interesting because some people have shown that actually intermittent fasting is better. It leads to more weight loss and a healthier individual. But the problem is that some people have argued that intermittent fasting simply ensures that you consume a lower number of calories overall because you're restricting the number of hours in which you can eat. And so you're actually reducing the number of calories. So I don't think it has been settled completely. But there's no question that eating moderately and not being overweight will help you in all sorts of ways. And obesity, it's amazing. We used to think obesity was only involved in a couple of things, atherosclerosis and so heart disease or diabetes. But now we're finding out it affects your chances of getting Alzheimer's. It affects cancer. So obesity really changes the metabolism of cells in a way that's not at all good for us.
one of the questions I would have for you is, do you think that humans have a finite limit to their ability to live, a finite age, or can we continue to extend our scientific research and impact on late morbidity and have people actually live to 200-300 years, as some people believe?
Yeah, so I would say currently our lifespan is about 120 years. That is the maximum lifespan, and very, very few people live beyond 110. And so I would say 100, somewhere around 110 plus is our natural limit. But there's no physical or chemical law that we can't extend that, because there are species that live, 300 or 400 years. So of course they're very different animals from us. They have different metabolism and so on. So the question is, can we tinker with our metabolism and still keep us human and live beyond that limit? So I would say maybe, and certainly the more optimistic elements of the community feel that that's very much possible. I'm less sure, but I would say there's no physical or chemical law against it.
I guess the biggest issue would be living long but living healthy, because I think the normal pattern is that towards the end of your life you have this, lots of morbidity that gets compressed together and culminates in your death. I mean, ideally, if we could just live healthy till the moment we no longer are alive, that would be ideal. Maybe the better question to be asking scientifically is, what can we do to compress the morbidity? I mean, a great number of us at the age of 80, 90 are going to experience Alzheimer's. What can we do about that? A great number of us will, succumb to one or other chronic illness as the only reason that we're going to die at that point. So it seems to me that's where the research dollar might be better spent. But what can we do about the compression of morbidity?
Yeah, this is a very difficult problem. So if you look at the funding for aging research and you ask, why are you working on aging? Nearly all of them, certainly the mainstream people, I pointed out there are some on one end of the spectrum who want us to live much longer lives. But most of them would say, we just want you to live more healthily as you age. And in fact, the chief scientist of Altos Labs, which is this multi-billion-dollar startup that was funded by some tech billionaires in California, Rick Klausner, said, our goal is for everyone to die young after a very long time. So the idea is that you just stay youthful and then suddenly you collapse. Now, currently what has happened is we are living longer compared to, say, even 50 years ago, but we're spending we're actually spending more years with lots of morbidities. So we're not actually, we haven't shrunk that period of decline. And that compression of morbidity is what the goal of the community is. But of course, you could ask, if you are young, what would suddenly cause you to collapse and die? There's no evidence for that. And all the evidence suggests that as you improve medicine and keep people living longer, they go through this longer period of morbidity. In fact, so it's the opposite. And so I'm not completely convinced that compression of morbidity is actually even possible. But there is one piece of evidence, which is that people who live over 110, many of them, in a study of centenarians, many of them live extraordinarily healthy lives and then suddenly decline and die. So there is at least a small cohort for whom that's possible. But of course, we may be looking at selection bias. These are people who, for various reasons of luck, both environmental luck and life history luck, and as well as genetics, have dodged all the bullets. They've dodged heart disease, diabetes, etc., and they somehow have managed to reach the very limits of their natural lifespan, and then things start breaking down. I'm not sure that's possible. And the other thing you pointed out about Alzheimer's is a very important point. That is going to be one of the biggest problems as we age. And the reckoning is that as we start living longer, more and more of us are going to come down with dementias of various types. And that's how we're going to end up in our old age. And that's not a great thing to look forward to. And so until we're able to tackle the aging of the brain and diseases of aging of the brain like Alzheimer's, I'm afraid that compression of morbidity will be rather hard.
Thank you. I must say, when I first read about cloning and Dolly the sheep, it seemed to a lot of people who were heavily invested in longevity and who were freezing their bodies or freezing their brains alone, that this would be the solution. I mean, I know it's not, but I want to ask you two levels of question. One is, if you could clone yourself, what exactly would that mean in terms, have you really extended your life so you have your original self that's dying perhaps, and now you have an exact copy of you at that same age? So sort of a science fiction question, what would that mean? But secondly, why has that not been possible after so much hype and promise?
Well, are you talking of cryonics, or are you talking about, I mean, there are several aspects to this. At one level, there are people who simply freeze their whole bodies or have their bodies frozen. Now, the problem with that is, in the process, they've replaced all of the fluid in the body with something like an antifreeze that doesn't form ice. And then which means they've killed off essentially all of the cells, and then they're freezing the body in liquid nitrogen. No one has ever shown this to work, even for a small animal like a mouse. And so the idea that this is going to work for human beings is, I mean, to me, there's absolutely no evidence for it. And of course, the companies don't actually promise that you're going to come back alive. And they simply say, here's a contract, this is a procedure we'll apply to your body, and give us $200,000 and we'll store you. And of course, billionaires for whom $200,000 is not even pocket change feel, well, it's very unlikely to work, but what if it does? And so I might as well have it done, just in case. So I think that there's a weird kind of rationalization of this. But the other idea is even more bizarre, which is the idea that our brain is some sort of computer and you could simply copy it to some sort of hard drive and then reconstruct it. And of course, and so some people are actually only freezing their head. And this is also bizarre because no one has shown you can preserve even the connections between neurons for something as large as a human brain. It's been done for a mouse brain, but remember, preserving the connections is not the same as preserving the state of the brain, because you don't know what the state of each neuron was. And so it's not as if you're going to thaw that mouse out and the mouse is going to suddenly start thinking from where it left off. It's essentially dead. You have to kill the mouse by injecting these embalming fluids. And so this is really bizarre, and yet there are people who do this. And I think the brain is a computer, certainly of some kind, but it's more complicated than a digital computer with just on and off for each node. Neurons have, they're alive. They have all these different states and physiology, and to be able to reproduce all that, we are nowhere near that. This is completely in the realm of science fiction. Cloning is different, but cloning is simply producing a genetically identical offspring. So you would be as much, the clone would be as much you as an identical twin as you. So it would, and actually less so, because it would have been born and brought up in a different era and not even had the same sort of environment as an identical twin. So it wouldn't be the same as you propagating your own consciousness and living on forever.
Is it feasible though? Because logic and good science has never stopped people from trying to do certain things.
Oh, I'm sure cloning is feasible because it's been done in a number of mammals. It's not very efficient. So when you try to do cloning of animals, lots and lots of the trials result in aborted fetuses, and only a very small number actually continue to term. But some of them are healthy. So Dolly the sheep, the first animal cloned, was very sickly. And people thought that that's because you started off from an aged cell, an adult cell that had already aged. And so you weren't resetting the clock. So you basically were starting off with an old sheep, and so it was old. But it turns out that's not necessarily true. Some of the other animals cloned around that time lived normal lives and seemed healthy. So cloning is definitely possible, but I wouldn't say it has anything to do with aging any more than having children has to do with aging.
So this is a wonderful book, highly enjoyable to read. So please be sure to get your copy. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. So I think there are volunteers with microphones, and we have a lot of eager people in the front row. So let's.
Well, one of the problems is I find the sound here not very good, and I have hearing aids. So if you can speak loudly and slowly, that will help.
So where are the microphones?
And I know Indians especially tend to speak English in this rapid-fire way, which is hard to understand in this environment.
Hello, sir. Thank you for an amazing session. I just wanted to talk about research I read a couple of years back.
Sorry, you'll have to speak slower and louder.
Sorry. So I read a research. It's a longitudinal study by Robert Waldinger. He's Harvard Adult Development. So it was about lot of people. It was a longitudinal study, and it was found out that at the end, social connections and the way we surround ourselves with people who matter to us, that is leading to a healthier and longer life. So that was a very humanistic approach to it, and I wanted to understand how the biological relation is between the need for love.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, which we didn't have time to discuss, and that is there are a number of social factors that seem to improve health in old age. And reduce mortality. One of them is social isolation. Social isolation actually increases mortality. So the moral is that as you get older, don't isolate yourself, don't be lonely, but have a circle of friends and community. Another very important aspect related to that is having a sense of purpose. And you wouldn't think that something like that would have a direct effect on mortality, but it does. So it turns out people with a sense of purpose have reduced mortality. Maybe they're related to some extent. I mean, there's some correlation there. Now, we don't understand how the brain and the body interact physiologically to have these effects, but it has been observed.
So the biological connection is not proved yet.
The biological connection is not clear. So these are purely sociological observations.
So thanks a lot. Great discussion. I wanted to understand how your science is related to healthy food. We hear about healthy food leading to a good life. If I constantly eat healthy food and live a good life, can I live a long life?
Well, there's an old joke where a patient goes to a doctor and the doctor says, eat very moderately, don't smoke, don't drink, and you'll live a lot longer. And the patient says, really, if I do these 3 or 4 things, I'll live a lot longer? And the doctor says, well, I'm not sure, but it'll feel like it. So anyway, but it is true that a moderate diet, and by moderate and healthy diet, which is a mixture of fruits and vegetables and high fiber and less ultra-processed food, the combination of that sort of diet with regular exercise, and adequate sleep. Those three things today are better than any anti-aging medicine on the market. That may not always be true, but currently that is true.
What are your thoughts on euthanasia?
Well, euthanasia not really directly related to the biology of aging. So, my thoughts as a person are not particularly relevant any more than anybody else. I think it's unfair to ask people to live through long periods of extreme discomfort and morbidity. So I'm sympathetic to the idea, but I also think it's something that needs to be very carefully regulated, because you can have all sorts of social pressures on someone to prematurely end their lives even when they don't feel like it. So I would say it's a tricky question with arguments on both sides.
Nutraceuticals.
Sorry?
Nutraceuticals, the companies,
Yes.
they sell turmeric now for the curcuminoids in it. So there are questions whether curcuminoids are really bioavailable in the body. So I was wondering whether both of you have any feedback on those.
It's talking about blueberries and things like that. Well, there are people who...
Turmeric,
turmeric,
specifically
for example.
turmeric.
Yeah, so people did a study, the NIH did a study on curcumin, which is the active ingredient of turmeric, and found no real effect on mice. But having said that, some supplements may have a biological basis, because our ability to make certain kinds of chemicals in our body declines with age. And so if we were able to provide the precursors to those chemicals, then we would be able to make higher levels of those chemicals and maybe reverse some of the consequences of aging. And one area that's a big hot topic are these drugs that are precursors of something called NAD. And there are studies in animals which suggest it has some positive benefits, although not increase in longevity as far as I know, but certainly some improvement in health indicators in older animals. And so a lot of people are, including 2 Nobel Prize winners I know, one of them in Cambridge, are popping these NAD precursors. Again, truly randomized clinical trials on humans is still lacking. They're somewhat observational studies and animal trials. But I wouldn't rule it out that they have some benefit.
Is there likely to be a cure for dementia in the near future?
It's a little hard, because the brain itself is a very hard target for any kind of therapy. It has a barrier called the blood-brain barrier, which makes it more difficult to get things in and out of the brain. The other problem is that people are not sure of all of the sequence of events that leads to Alzheimer's or other dementia. There's certainly a lot of evidence implicating 2 proteins, beta amyloid and tau, in the process. But there's a lot of argument about where in the pathway these proteins act and whether they're really responsible for the final death of neurons that causes disease. So I think there's a lot of fundamental work that needs to be done. I'm not an expert on dementia, and maybe Abraham's a physician, he might have a better idea than I do.
No, I think you said it well. I couldn't add more to that. Yeah. Over there.
Fascinating to listen to both of you. Some of my relatives in the US are beginning to take some supplements called GLP-1. Would you be able to tell us more about it? They believe that it's going to reverse aging or arrest.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and it's something that's an omission in my book, because when I was writing it, the GLP-1 sort of buzz had not quite hit when I was actually writing my book about 2 years ago. But GLP-1 is a class of drugs which are mimic the peptide glucagon, and their immediate effect is to suppress appetite, and they're given as weight loss drugs. And so they're prescribed for people who are extremely obese or people who have really bad diabetes as a result of obesity. Now, there's no question if you are in that class, GLP-1 will help you. Of course, you have to keep taking GLP-1. You can't just stop. But then people found that GLP-1 has all sorts of other effects. For example, it seems to have a beneficial effect on inflammation, even on Alzheimer's and so on. And so there is some talk about GLP-1, a class of drugs, being potentially useful as an anti-aging drug. And I would say it's promising, but we don't know what the long-term effects of GLP-1 are. It's too early to tell. And this is a problem with all anti-aging medicine. If you have a serious disease, let's say of cancer, you will take very nasty treatment in order to kill the cancer off, because otherwise you're going to die, right? But if you're just going to take an anti-aging drug in the hope that you're going to live longer, 10 years longer down the road, then the equation is very different. The bar for safety and lack of side effects and so on is going to be much higher. And so, I think GLP-1 will have to meet that higher bar if it's going to be an anti-aging drug.
So,
Last question.
there's been a lot of literature on blue zones, which are areas around the world where people have longevity. Has any scientific research been done on blue zones? And second, I want to ask you another question which might be childish, a little personal. Do you have supplements? And if so, could you share what you have? It goes to both of you.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first. The blue zone thing, the only science that has come out recently is a study which showed that as soon as you started measuring birth records accurately, the effect started to disappear. So many of these people who are supposed to be very long-lived actually weren't that long-lived at all, after all. Of course, they may have had reasonably long lives, but not extraordinarily long lives. So that's something that came out in the last year or so. In terms of supplements, well, I do take several anti-aging drugs, and one of them is a statin for my cholesterol, and the other is about 3 or 4 blood pressure medications to keep my blood pressure under control. Now, you might not think of these as anti-aging medicines, but the whole rationale for this is to keep me healthier as I age. So, in a broad sense, they are anti-aging medicines.
So, Venki, if I may call you Venki, may I just say on behalf of all of us, we're so proud of you, proud of your Nobel Prize, proud to claim you as a South Indian, and congratulations not just on that, but on an extraordinarily readable book. You're missing out if you don't get this. Thank you for being so generous with your time, despite not having your luggage from Indigo. Did I mention that?
Thank you, Abraham. And I have to say, it was a real delight when I learned you were going to be my interlocutor, because, I'd known about you for a long time, ever since you wrote that beautiful book about AIDS patients in the rural South. So it's fantastic to have finally met you. Thank you.
And none of us as writers would exist without you, readers. So thank you so much for being here at this extraordinary festival. Thank you, Govind and Ravi, wherever you are, for putting this on. Most grateful.